History is filled with moments where the sky itself seemed to roar in judgment. We are exploring 25 intriguing tales of divine punishment, stories where ancient people believed they witnessed the direct and terrifying wrath of the gods. By the end, you'll gain a profound understanding of how our ancestors made sense of catastrophe and morality, seeing disaster not as random chance but as a cosmic verdict. We will examine a city erased from the map in a rain of fire and a ship found sailing with no crew. What common thread connects a king's feast to a sudden, violent end and an entire community dancing itself to death? These narratives are far more than superstition. They are powerful windows into the human soul, revealing our deepest fears about pride, sacrilege, and the consequences of overstepping our bounds. What does it say about us that we so often see a moral lesson in tragedy? Our journey into these tales begins not with fire from heaven, but with silence broken in a desert valley. In November of 1922, after years of meticulous search, the British archaeologist Howard Carter made a small breach in a sealed doorway. Holding a candle, he peered into the darkness. "What are your eyes seeing?" his financier Lord Carnarvon asked from behind him. Carter's reply has become legendary. Wonderful things. He was gazing into the nearly intact burial chamber of the boy King Tutankhamun, a tomb untouched for over 3,000 years. The air was thick, stale, and carried the weight of centuries. Gold gleamed in the flickering light, and strange animal-headed statues stood guard. It was a moment of unparalleled archaeological triumph, yet woven into the fabric of this discovery was a thread of ominous warning. Among the treasures were artifacts bearing inscriptions meant for the eyes of gods and the ears of the dead. One, a clay tablet reportedly found in the antechamber, carried a chilling promise. "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." At the time, many dismissed it as mere ritual text, a standard deterrent from a superstitious age. They could not have foreseen how swiftly that promise would seem to be fulfilled. Just a few months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the entire expedition, fell violently ill in Cairo. The cause was a seemingly minor mosquito bite on his cheek that he had nicked while shaving. The wound became infected, leading to blood poisoning and pneumonia. He died on April 5, 1923. The press, hungry for a sensational story, seized upon the circumstances. At the exact moment of Carnarvon's death, back in England, the lights in his family home reportedly flickered and went out. His beloved dog, Susie, let out a howl and dropped dead. This was the spark that ignited the legend of the curse of the pharaohs. The narrative grew with each subsequent tragedy. Arthur Mace, another key member of the excavation team, died in a similar manner, succumbing to gradual poisoning without a clear cause. Carnarvon's half-brother died unexpectedly. A radiologist who X-rayed the mummy died. A visitor to the tomb died. The list compiled by newspapers seemed to confirm a pattern of supernatural retribution. Science, of course, would later offer its own testimony. Researchers proposed that sealed tombs could cultivate ancient bacteria or toxic molds like Aspergillus, which could cause severe respiratory illness when unleashed. Others pointed to the psychological power of suggestion, or simply the statistical probability that people involved in a major project would die over time. But for the public in the 1920s, and for many who felt the chill of the tomb's atmosphere, logic was no match for the story. They saw a clear line from sacrilege to consequence. A sacred space meant for eternal rest had been violated. The ancient gods of Egypt, or perhaps the vengeful spirit of the king himself, had enacted a divine punishment. It was a narrative that transformed archaeological curiosity into a moral parable about the dangers of pride, of overreaching, of disturbing what was meant to stay hidden. The Curse of the Pharaohs became the modern world's most famous ghost story, proving that our need to see meaning in misfortune is as powerful today as it was in the ancient deserts. The silence of the Egyptian tomb gives way to a far more explosive soundscape, a cataclysm so immense it became the ultimate benchmark for divine wrath. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not merely a tale from Genesis, it is a foundational pillar in humanity's imagination of punishment from above. For centuries, scholars and archaeologists have pondered its possible roots in real geography and real disaster. The most likely setting points to the stark, dramatic landscape at the southern end of the Dead Sea, a region geologically prone to upheaval, rich in flammable bitumen, and bearing scars that suggest a once fertile plain met a sudden, violent end. Into this setting, the biblical narrative paints a picture of two cities so consumed by corruption and cruelty that their very name became synonymous with sin. Their specific wickedness, as the story tells, included a profound violation of the sacred ancient law of hospitality, when two angels appearing as travelers sought shelter in the home of a man named Lot. A mob surrounded the house demanding to brutalize the guests. Lot's desperate attempt to protect them only highlights the depth of the city's moral decay. The divine verdict was final, as Lot and his family were hurried out of the city by the angels with a stern warning. The command was absolute. Do not look back, do not linger, escape for your life. Then the sky erupted. The Lord rained down fire and brimstone from the heavens upon Sodom and Gomorrah. The description is of a comprehensive, supernatural inferno that utterly consumed everything, turning a thriving valley into a smoking wasteland. In her terror, or perhaps in her mourning for the life she was leaving, Lot's wife disobeyed. She turned and looked back upon the destruction. In that instant, she was transformed into a pillar of salt, a permanent and chilling monument to the cost of hesitation and disobedience in the face of divine command. For millennia, this story has served as a potent moral parable, a stark warning against collective sin, hubris, and the violation of sacred duties. Its power lies in its visceral imagery, a complete eradication that feels both terrifying and final. Modern science offers intriguing lenses through which to view the legend. Some researchers propose a catastrophic natural event, like a massive meteor airburst exploding in the atmosphere with the force of a nuclear blast, instantly incinerating the region and showering it with superheated debris. Others point to a major earthquake along the seismically active Dead Sea Transform Fault, which could have triggered widespread fires from ignited subsurface bitumen and released poisonous gases, creating a hellscape that survivors could only interpret as the wrath of God. Whether seen as literal history, inspired metaphor, or a combination of both, the tale endures because it answers a deep human need to believe that profound evil cannot stand, that the universe itself has a moral compass, and that sometimes that compass corrects its course with fire. From the ashes of two cities, we move to a confrontation that reshaped a nation. The story of the plagues of Egypt is a masterclass in narrative escalation, where divine punishment is not a single cataclysmic event, but a deliberate and layered dismantling of an entire world order. It begins with a simple yet impossible demand. Let my people go. Pharaoh, considered a god-king himself, refuses. What follows is a series of 10 afflictions, each one more severe than the last, systematically targeting the very foundations of Egyptian life, power, and religion. This was far more than a display of raw power. Each plague carried a profound symbolic insult, a direct challenge to a specific Egyptian deity. When the life-giving waters of the Nile turned to blood, it was an affront to Hapi, the god of the annual flood that brought fertility. Frogs, associated with the goddess Hecate who presided over birth, overran homes and beds, turning a symbol of life into one of grotesque nuisance. The plague of gnats or lice rising from the dust struck at the earth god Geb. Flies swarmed, perhaps challenging the fly god or simply representing the corruption of the air. The death of livestock was a blow to the bull god Apis and the cow goddess Hathor, sacred embodiments of strength and nourishment. Boils breaking out on skin challenged the healing gods like Sekhmet and Isis. Hail and fire mixed, something unheard of in Egypt's climate, mocked Nut, the sky goddess, and Shu, god of the atmosphere. Locusts devouring what remained of the crops scorned Nepri, the grain god. Then came a darkness so thick it could be felt, a 3-day gloom that utterly vanquished Ra, the supreme sun god, the very heart of Pharaoh's own divine claim. Each step was a message: your gods are powerless, your world is an illusion I can unravel at will. The final, terrible plague moved beyond symbolism to the most intimate form of loss. The death of the firstborn sons, from the palace to the cattle stall, was a judgment so personal and comprehensive it finally broke Pharaoh's will. The Israelites, instructed to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, were passed over. This event, Passover, became the defining moment of liberation, triggering the Exodus. The narrative is clear. This was divine punishment executed on a national scale, not for the sins of the oppressed Israelites, but to shatter the oppressor and demonstrate a supreme power greater than any empire or pantheon. For centuries, scholars and scientists have debated the possible natural mechanisms behind these events. Could a chain reaction explain them? A massive volcanic eruption, like the catastrophic blast of Thera on the island of Santorini, could have spewed ash that reddened rivers, triggered climatic chaos leading to hail and darkness, and poisoned waters causing algal blooms that looked like blood and drove toxic frogs from the Nile. Subsequent pestilence and disease could have spread through insect vectors, affecting livestock and humans alike. A final, tragic event like an outbreak of food poisoning from grain stored in firstborn's privileged portions might explain the selective nature of the final plague. The historical debate is fascinating, but it does not diminish the power of the story. Whether seen as a sequence of miracles or a divinely guided convergence of natural disasters, the core message remains. It is a foundational tale of justice, of a power that intervenes on behalf of the marginalized, and of the catastrophic cost of hardened pride. It asks us to consider what happens when power refuses to listen, and what forces might be unleashed to make it hear. The concept of a society obliterated for its sins finds its most iconic form not in a desert or a river valley, but beneath the waves. Plato, the great philosopher of ancient Greece, gave the world a story so vivid it has haunted our imagination for over 2,000 years. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 B.C., he describes a powerful and advanced island nation called Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. This was no ordinary place. Plato recounts a society of immense wealth and sophistication, with grand architecture, complex canals, and a thriving culture that commanded a vast maritime empire. Their technology and knowledge were said to surpass all others of their time, but with this power came a profound moral decay. The people of Atlantis, originally virtuous and orderly, gradually succumbed to their own baser instincts. Greed consumed them. They became militarily aggressive, seeking to conquer and enslave, even launching an unprovoked war against the noble city of Athens. This was the turning point. For Plato, their corruption was not just a political failing, it was a spiritual one, an act of hubris that challenged the natural order upheld by the gods. Seeing the island's descent into avarice and violence, the deities, led by Zeus, convened to determine a fitting punishment. The sentence was absolute and terrifyingly swift. In a single day and night of misfortune, as Plato writes, the entire island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and disappeared. Earthquakes of unimaginable force shattered the land, and the ocean rushed in to claim it forever. This was not a slow erosion or a gradual decline. It was a divine erasure, a complete and final removal of a civilization that had lost its right to exist. The story's power lies in its scale and its moral clarity. A whole world, advanced and proud, was judged unworthy and wiped from the map. For centuries, scholars and explorers have been captivated by the question of whether Atlantis was pure allegory or a memory of a real catastrophe. Many point to the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, which experienced a colossal eruption around 1600 B.C. that devastated the Minoan civilization and could have inspired tales of a lost island kingdom. Others have searched from the Azores in the mid-Atlantic to the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara, looking for geological clues. Yet the truth of its physical location may be less important than the enduring lesson Plato embedded in the narrative. Atlantis stands as the ultimate cautionary tale. It warns that no matter how advanced, wealthy, or powerful a society becomes, it is not immune to collapse if it abandons justice, moderation, and respect for higher laws. The punishment was not for being advanced, but for being arrogant. The sea did not swallow a city, it swallowed a warning, one that echoes whenever a civilization confuses its technological might with moral infallibility. A civilization can vanish beneath the sea, but sometimes divine judgment arrives not with earth-shattering force, but with the silent, chilling stroke of a finger. The story shifts from the grand collapse of empires to a single, opulent banquet hall in ancient Babylon. King Belshazzar, grandson of the mighty Nebuchadnezzar, was at the height of his power. To celebrate, he threw a feast of legendary proportions. 1,000 of his lords and their concubines gathered in the great palace. Wine flowed freely, and the air was thick with the sounds of revelry and pride. But in a profound act of hubris, Belshazzar commanded his servants to bring forth the most sacred objects from the conquered temple in Jerusalem, the gold and silver vessels dedicated to the God of Israel. He, his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them, toasting gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. They used the holy to celebrate the profane. In the midst of this sacrilegious celebration, a terrifying sight materialized on the plaster wall of the royal palace. Fingers of a human hand appeared and began to write, illuminated as if by a lone candle, tracing words no one could understand. The king watched, his face drained of color, his knees knocked together, and his legs gave way beneath him. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a silence of pure dread. He called for his wise men and enchanters, promising royal purple, a gold chain, and authority as third ruler in the kingdom to anyone who could read the writing. But none could decipher the message. The queen mother then remembered a man from the days of Nebuchadnezzar, a captive from Judah known for his wisdom and connection to the divine spirit. Daniel was brought before the terrified king. He declined the rewards but offered the interpretation. The words were mean, tekel, and parson. Mean, Daniel explained, meant that God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel meant that the king had been weighed on the scales and found wanting, his moral and spiritual worth insufficient. Parson meant that his kingdom was divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The judgment was personal, precise, and immediate. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Darius the Mede took the kingdom. The punishment was not for a lifetime of vague evil, but for a specific, arrogant act of sacrilege using sacred vessels to praise false gods in a public display of contempt. It was a direct response to a direct provocation. The writing on the wall became the ultimate symbol of an unavoidable verdict, a moment where the cosmic ledger is balanced in full view, and the sentence is carried out before the ink is dry. It asks a haunting question of every power, every individual in their moment of greatest pride. If you were weighed on the scales tonight, what would they reveal? The writing on the wall foretold a kingdom's end, but some verdicts are written in stone and ash. In the late summer of the year 79, the people living in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius had no such warning. For generations, the mountain had been quiet, its slopes lush with vineyards. The city of Pompeii was a thriving, vibrant port, a place of commerce and leisure for wealthy Romans. Its streets were lined with bakeries, taverns, and elaborate homes adorned with frescoes celebrating life, love, and mythology. There was a sense of security, even of divine favor, as Pompeii was famously under the patronage of Venus, the goddess of love and prosperity. Yet, on the morning of August 24th, that security shattered. The mountain awoke with a violence that defied comprehension. A towering column of ash and pumice rocketed into the sky, darkening the sun for miles around. For those who witnessed it, like the young writer Pliny the Younger watching from across the bay, this was not merely a geological event, it was a spectacle of supernatural terror. In his letters, he described the cloud as resembling a gigantic pine tree, rising to an impossible height before spreading out like branches. He wrote of sheets of fire and leaping flames, of a darkness blacker and thicker than any night. To the Roman mind, steeped in a religion where gods controlled every aspect of the natural world, such an event could only be one thing: a display of divine anger. The question was, why? What had provoked such a catastrophic punishment? Many contemporaries pointed to the perceived moral decay of the era. Pompeii was known for its lavish lifestyles, its indulgence in pleasures, and its vibrant, sometimes scandalous cult practices. The city had a significant temple to the Egyptian goddess Isis, reflecting a shift in popular piety that traditional Romans might have viewed as impiety toward the old gods. Perhaps Venus, the city's own protector, had withdrawn her favor in disgust, or perhaps the eruption represented a battle among the gods themselves, with Jupiter, king of the gods, unleashing the fury of Vulcan, god of fire, against a city that had strayed. The punishment was horrifically thorough. After hours of falling pumice that collapsed roofs, the final blow came not from above but in a lateral surge. A pyroclastic flow, a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and rock, raced down the mountain at hurricane speeds. It engulfed Pompeii and the nearby town of Herculaneum in an instant, burying everything under meters of volcanic material. The heat was so intense it vaporized soft tissue and left voids in the hardened ash where people fell. Centuries later, archaeologists would fill these voids with plaster, creating heartbreaking casts of the victims in their final moments: a man covering his mouth, a family huddled together, a dog contorted in agony. This is what makes the story of Pompeii uniquely powerful in our list of divine punishments. It is not a legend or a moral fable passed down through generations. It is a forensic snapshot. The preserved buildings, the carbonized bread in the ovens, the graffiti on the walls, all present an unedited portrait of daily life abruptly terminated. We are not imagining the decadence or the piety, we are walking through its frozen remains. The eruption forces us to confront a terrifying idea. What if the gods do not send cryptic writings or targeted plagues, but instead simply turn away, allowing the indifferent, brutal machinery of the earth to become the instrument of their judgment? The silence of those plaster casts speaks louder than any prophecy. The silent, plaster forms of Pompeii are fixed in time, but the sea holds mysteries that drift. In December of 1872, a ship named the Mary Celeste was spotted adrift in the calm Atlantic between the Azores and Portugal. The British brigantine de Gracia hailed her but received no answer. A boarding party climbed aboard to find a scene of profound and eerie tranquility. The vessel was seaworthy with its sails partially set, yet not a soul was on board. In the galley, a meal was prepared and left uneaten. The crew's personal belongings, including pipes and sewing kits, lay undisturbed in their quarters. The ship's cargo of industrial alcohol was largely intact. The lifeboat was missing, but there was no sign of a struggle, no violence, and no log entry explaining the catastrophe. It was as if the 10 people aboard had simply evaporated into the salt air. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, was a respected and experienced mariner, found to have left behind his navigational sextant and chronometer, items no sane sailor would abandon without dire cause. The last log entry, dated 10 days prior, noted nothing more alarming than routine sailing. In an age of burgeoning industry and scientific confidence, this ghost ship presented a riddle that logic could not easily solve. The official inquiry could only rule it an abandonment due to unknown causes, but the public, fueled by sensational newspaper reports, craved a story far darker than a mundane accident. In the absence of facts, imagination rushed in. Some whispered of piracy, yet nothing of value was taken. Others proposed a sudden waterspout or a minor seaquake that frightened the crew into a panicked, fatal evacuation. A more scientific theory suggested that fumes from the alcohol cargo could have built up, leading the captain to order everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution, only for the tow line to snap, leaving them adrift as the perfectly sound Mary Celeste sailed on without them. Yet for the Victorian mind, steeped in Gothic novels and a lingering belief in the supernatural, these explanations felt insufficient. The true horror of the Mary Celeste was its antiseptic silence. There was no monster, no storm, no clear villain. Its emptiness suggested a punishment so swift and complete that it left no evidence behind. The ship became a canvas upon which people projected their deepest anxieties about the modern age. Was it a vessel cursed from the start, perhaps haunted by a past tragedy? Had the crew committed some grave, secret sin that invited divine retribution upon the open ocean, a force that compelled them to flee into the abyss? It transformed from a maritime incident into a modern myth of divine or supernatural wrath, a reminder that even in the era of steam and telegraphy, the vast, indifferent sea could still deliver verdicts that made no human sense. The Mary Celeste endures not because we solved it, but because we could not. It represents the terrifying possibility that sometimes the punishment is not fire or flood, but simply to be erased from your own story, leaving behind only a perfectly preserved question. The silent disappearance of a crew speaks of mysteries without witnesses, but history also holds tragedies where the witnesses were multitudes, and the tragedy was their own fervent belief. In the spring of 1212, a different kind of movement stirred across France and the Rhineland, born not from papal decree or royal ambition, but from the visions of children. A young shepherd boy from Cloyes in France, named Stephen, arrived at the court of King Philip II claiming to bear a letter from Christ himself, commanding him to lead a crusade to peacefully reclaim Jerusalem. Around the same time, in Cologne, a boy named Nicholas began preaching a similar message, gathering followers with his charismatic certainty. Their argument was deceptively simple. The failure of the previous crusades, led by greedy and sinful knights, proved that only the pure in heart could succeed, who was more pure than the innocent. They believed the Mediterranean Sea would part for them, just as the Red Sea had for Moses, allowing them to walk dry-shod to the Holy Land. It was a powerful, intoxicating idea. From villages and farms, thousands of children and adolescents, along with some peasants, women, and the occasional disreputable adult, abandoned their homes to follow these youthful prophets. They marched under banners, singing hymns, convinced that divine favor would protect and nourish them. The reality was a harrowing journey of suffering. They had no supplies, no organization, and no true understanding of the vast distances involved. Many perished from hunger and exposure on the long trek across the Alps. Those who reached the Italian port cities like Genoa and Marseille faced a cruel disillusionment. The sea did not part. Instead, they found a world of merchants and shipmasters. Some were simply stranded, begging until they faded into the urban poor. Others met a far darker fate. According to chroniclers, unscrupulous merchants offered passage to groups of these children, only to sail them not to the Holy Land, but to the slave markets of North Africa and the Middle East, where they were sold into a life of bondage. Very few, if any, ever saw Jerusalem. The movement collapsed into a sprawling, diffuse catastrophe. For medieval chroniclers looking back, this was not a random disaster. It demanded a moral explanation. Some saw the tragedy as a divine punishment not upon the children, but upon the entire sinful society of adult Christendom. The corruption and greed of the church and the nobility had failed in their sacred duty, so God had inspired the innocent as a rebuke and then allowed their suffering as a judgment on the world that forced them to such a desperate hope. Others interpreted it as a punishment for the hubris of the venture itself, a lesson against following false prophets and believing that purity alone could overturn the harsh laws of geography and human nature. The Children's Crusade stands as one of history's most heartbreaking examples of faith weaponized by naivete. It reveals how the concept of divine punishment can be applied not just to the wicked, but to the misguided, and how a society will often interpret its own collective failures through the lens of a cosmic moral audit, even when the primary victims are the most vulnerable among them. A city of children vanished into slavery, but a capital of marble and empire would burn under its own ruler's gaze. In the sweltering July heat of 64 A.D., a fire broke out in the shops lining the Circus Maximus, Rome's great chariot racing stadium. Fanned by strong winds, the flames quickly became an uncontrollable beast. For 6 devastating days and 7 nights, the inferno raged through the narrow, winding streets of the ancient city. It leaped across firebreaks, consumed temples, palaces, and tenement blocks alike, and left entire districts in smoldering ruins. Thousands were left homeless, and the cultural heart of the empire was scarred with ash. In the midst of this catastrophe, the young Emperor Nero, who had been away at his coastal villa, rushed back to Rome. He threw open his own gardens to shelter the displaced, organized relief supplies, and planned for reconstruction. Yet his public actions were instantly shadowed by a far more persistent story. A rumor spread like the fire itself that Nero had taken to a private stage during the blaze, singing of the fall of Troy while accompanying himself on the lyre, indifferent to the suffering below. He did not literally fiddle, an instrument not yet invented, but the image was sealed in history, a perfect symbol of a leader's grotesque detachment. Even darker whispers suggested he had ordered the fire set himself to clear valuable land for his dream project, a sprawling, opulent palace complex he would call the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Whether true or not, the populace needed a culprit and their emperor needed a scapegoat. To divert this boiling anger, Nero fixed blame on a small, misunderstood, and secretive sect, the Christians. His punishment for them was theatrical in its cruelty. They were arrested in great numbers, some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. Others were coated in pitch, impaled on stakes, and set alight to serve as human torches for Nero's evening garden parties. Their horrific deaths were public spectacle, designed to purge the city's sin through the suffering of a chosen few. Yet for many Romans watching this brutality, a deeper unease took root. They wondered if the fire itself had been the true divine punishment, not for the Christians, but for Nero's own excesses, for the moral rot at the top of their society. The gods, perhaps, were expressing their fury at an emperor who saw himself as a divine artist, reshaping his realm through conflagration and blood. This duality is the core of the tale. The fire stands as a perceived cosmic judgment on a corrupt regime, while Nero's savage response represents a human attempt to pervert that judgment onto the innocent. It did not save him. His actions fueled widespread hatred among the people and the elite alike. Within 4 years, facing rebellion and declared a public enemy by the Senate, Nero would flee and take his own life, his legacy forever damned as the tyrant who fiddled while Rome burned and then bathed its streets in martyrs' blood. His punishment was not delivered by lightning from Jupiter, but by the relentless verdict of history, which remembered not his relief efforts, but his lyre and his human lamps. Rome burned to the sound of an emperor's lyre, but in a German city centuries later, the punishment was set to a far more frantic rhythm. The summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was already a season of deep dread. Harvests had failed repeatedly, bringing severe famine. syphilis and smallpox stalked the population. The poor lived under a crushing weight of superstition and fear, believing their suffering was a sign of God's displeasure. Into this atmosphere of collective anxiety stepped a woman named Frau Trophia. One hot July day, she walked into the street and began to dance. This was not a joyful expression, but a compulsive, violent, and uncontrollable convulsion. She danced for hours, then days, her feet bleeding, her body writhing beyond her control. When authorities intervened, she collapsed, only to resume the moment she was released. Then it spread. Within a week, 36 others had joined her in the street. Within a month, the number swelled to over 400 men, women, and children, all caught in the same relentless, exhausting frenzy. They danced until their ribs broke from the strain. They danced until they collapsed from strokes or heart attacks. Historical records suggest that at least 15 people a day were dying from sheer exertion, their bodies giving out on the cobblestones. The city council was terrified and utterly baffled. Their initial diagnosis, rooted in the medical theory of the time, was that the sufferers had an excess of hot blood. Their prescribed cure was more dancing. In a move that seems surreal to us, they cleared 2 guild halls, built a wooden stage, hired professional musicians and strong men to keep the afflicted moving, believing they needed to dance the poison out of their systems. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The official sanction, the constant music, and the public stage only fueled the epidemic, making the dancing seem like a sanctioned, even encouraged activity. For the terrified citizens of Strasbourg, there was only one explanation that made sense of this horror. They believed it was a curse, a divine punishment sent by Saint Vitus. Vitus was a Christian martyr, and by a strange twist of folklore, had become the patron saint invoked against a nervous disorder called Saint Vitus's dance. The logic turned in on itself. The community had sinned, so Saint Vitus, or God acting through him, had inflicted his very namesake disease upon them as a collective chastisement. The specific sins were debated, but generally pointed to the moral failings of the poor, their laziness, their impiety, their loose morals. The dancing plague was not an illness, it was a sermon written in spasming flesh. Modern science offers compelling alternate theories, looking for a physical trigger behind the psychological break. One leading candidate is ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on damp rye, the staple grain of the poor. It contains compounds related to LSD and can cause severe hallucinations, convulsions, and a burning sensation in the limbs that victims might try to dance away. Given the poor harvests and stored grain, contaminated bread is a plausible culprit. The other dominant theory is mass psychogenic illness, a form of mass hysteria where extreme psychological stress, in this case from famine, disease, and pervasive fear of damnation, manifests as physical symptoms. In a culture that believed God spoke through disasters, the idea of a punishing dance could spread through suggestion like a virus, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy of torment. Whether triggered by toxin or trauma, the true punishment was the interpretation. A community already on its knees saw its own suffering not as bad luck or biology, but as proof of its own wickedness. The dancers were not just ill, they were living, gasping evidence of divine wrath. Their very bodies turned into instruments of their own condemnation. The frantic, public suffering of the dancing plague was a punishment witnessed by all, but some curses are whispered, carried in the deep blue heart of a stolen treasure. From the fevered streets of Strasbourg, we turn to a more intimate and glittering form of doom, a legend as meticulously cut as the gemstone at its center. The Hope Diamond story begins not in a European vault, but in the sacred soil of India. According to the persistent lore, the original stone was much larger, a magnificent blue diamond that once served as the eye in a statue of the Hindu goddess Sita, the very embodiment of devotion and virtue. In the 17th century, a French merchant and adventurer named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier is said to have stolen the gem directly from that idol. this was no simple theft. It was a profound sacrilege, a violation of a divine image. The curse, as the story goes, was invoked in that moment, a spiritual poison bound to the stone that would afflict anyone who came to possess it. Tavernier's own fate is murky, with some later tales claiming he was torn apart by wild dogs, a detail historians find no evidence for, but one that perfectly fits the narrative of cosmic retribution. The stone, now cut down, made its way to the court of King Louis XVI of France, who gifted it to his queen, Marie Antoinette. Their gruesome ends during the French Revolution, both dying by the guillotine, became the cornerstone of the diamond's cursed reputation. The revolution had countless complex causes, but in the popular imagination, the gem provided a simple, satisfying reason: the wrath of a wronged goddess finally catching up to the decadent monarchy that displayed her plundered eye. The diamond vanished for a time, resurfacing in the 19th century with a string of reported misfortunes for its various owners, from financial ruin to untimely death, each story adding another facet to the legend. Its most famous modern owner was the American heiress Evelyn Walsh McLean. She bought the diamond in 1911, defiantly wearing it as a good luck charm, convinced she could tame its malevolence. Her life, however, became a catalogue of tragedy that seemed to validate the curse. Her young son died in a car accident. Her daughter died by suicide. Her husband abandoned her and was later committed to a mental institution. She died broke and alone, her vast fortune dissipated. Even those who merely handled the stone were not spared in the telling. Jewelers who recut it, couriers who transported it, all were woven into the tapestry of ill fortune. To separate the verified history from the embellished lore is crucial. Jean-Baptiste Tavernier likely acquired the diamond through trade, not temple robbery, and died of old age. Many of the tragic events linked to the stone, like the fall of the French monarchy, were seismic historical shifts with explanations far beyond a gemstone. Evelyn McLean's profound personal sufferings were real, but they were also the kind of devastating losses that can befall any family, rich or poor. Yet, the power of the curse narrative is undeniable. It transforms random misfortune into a coherent moral drama. The Hope Diamond Curse is the ultimate archetype of divine punishment made portable, a physical object that carries the stain of its original sin. It punishes not for personal moral failings, but for the act of possession itself, especially possession rooted in theft from the sacred. It speaks to a deep-seated belief that beauty and wealth acquired through violation come with a hidden, terrible cost, and that the universe has a way of balancing the books, one glittering, blue misfortune at a time. A jewel carries a curse of stolen divinity, but an entire fleet can be weighed down by the burden of a holy war. In the summer of 1588, the greatest naval force ever assembled by the Spanish Empire, the Invincible Armada, set sail with a sacred mission. King Philip II, a monarch whose piety was as vast as his realm, had launched what he called the Enterprise of England. His goal was nothing less than the overthrow of the Protestant heretic Queen Elizabeth I, the restoration of Catholicism, and the decisive end of English piracy and support for rebels in the Spanish Netherlands. For Philip, this was not merely a military campaign, it was a crusade. Priests blessed the ships and sailors, and the fleet carried a sense of divine mandate. The Spanish commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was a nobleman of great loyalty but little naval experience, a choice that would later be seen as a fatal flaw. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, link with the Duke of Parma's army waiting in the Netherlands, and ferry that formidable force across for a direct invasion. The English fleet, commanded by figures like Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake, was smaller, faster, and more maneuverable, armed with longer-range guns. They chose not to engage the massive Spanish crescent formation head-on, but to harass it, sniping at the edges as the Armada progressed up the channel. The first major blow was not from cannon fire but from fire itself. On the night of July 28th, the English sent 8 old ships packed with pitch, tar, and gunpowder, set ablaze and drifting with the wind and tied directly into the anchored Spanish fleet at Calais. These hellburners, as they were called, created panic. The tight, defensive crescent formation, essential for the Armada's protection, shattered as captains cut their anchor cables to escape the floating infernos scattering into the darkness. The next day, at the Battle of Gravelines, the now disorganized Spanish ships were pounded by the English artillery. Yet the true catastrophe was still to come. Battered and unable to regroup with Parma's forces, Medina Sidonia made the fateful decision to abandon the invasion and save the fleet by sailing north around Scotland and Ireland to return home to Spain. It was here that divine judgment, in the eyes of contemporaries, was most clearly written. The ships, already damaged and low on supplies, sailed directly into a series of ferocious autumn storms in the North Atlantic. Gale-force winds drove them onto the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Ships foundered, broke apart, and sank. Thousands of Spanish soldiers and sailors, survivors of the battles, drowned in the cold seas or were slaughtered on the beaches when they made landfall. Of the 130 ships that had set out, less than half made it back to Spain, and those that returned were often shattered hulks, their crews broken by disease and starvation. The human and material cost was catastrophic. In England, the reaction was euphoric and deeply theological. They called it the Protestant wind. The storms that destroyed the enemy were not seen as mere weather, but as the breath of God himself, intervening to protect his chosen Protestant nation and punish the hubristic Catholic aggressor. Medals were struck bearing the inscription, "He blew with his winds and they were scattered." For Spain, the defeat was a national trauma, a blow to both its military prestige and its spiritual certainty. In the soul-searching that followed, some within Spain itself began to question whether the disaster was in fact a divine chastisement. Had King Philip's immense pride in his holy enterprise provoked God's anger? Were the sins and cruelties of the Spanish Empire across the New World coming home to roost? The same event, a fleet destroyed by wind and wave, became two opposing miracles. For one side, it was a deliverance, a sign of favor. For the other, it was a humbling, a sign of displeasure. The Armada's fate demonstrates with stunning clarity how divine punishment is never just about the event itself, but about the story we need to tell in its aftermath, a story that transforms shattered timbers and drowned men into proof of a moral universe. A fleet could be scattered by the wrath of the Protestant wind, but an entire community could vanish into the whispering forests of a new world, leaving behind only a single carved word. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke is not just America's oldest unsolved mystery. It is a profound tale of how a society interprets catastrophe as divine judgment. In 1587, a group of about 115 English men, women, and children, led by Governor John White, established a settlement on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Their mission was to plant a permanent English foothold in the New World, a godly community that would also serve as a base for privateering against Spanish ships. The venture was fraught from the start, marked by strained relations with the local Secotan people and a desperate shortage of supplies. Later that year, Governor White was forced to sail back to England for more provisions, leaving behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, and the entire vulnerable colony. He expected to return within months. History and a war with Spain had other plans. White's return was delayed for 3 agonizing years. When he finally stepped back onto Roanoke Island in August of 1590, he found a scene of utter desolation. The settlement was completely abandoned. The houses and fortifications had been carefully dismantled, not destroyed, suggesting a planned departure. There were no signs of battle, no graves, and no cryptic messages of distress. Only 2 clues remained. The letters CRO were carved into a tree at the edge of the settlement. Farther in, on a post of the fort's palisade, was carved the full word Croatoan. This was not a random scribble. Before White left, they had agreed that if the colonists were forced to leave, they would carve a Maltese cross into a tree as a sign of danger. There was no cross. The word Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, home to a Native American tribe that had been friendly to the English. It seemed to be a deliberate pointer. Yet, when storms and misfortune prevented White from sailing to Croatoan Island to investigate, the clue became a maddening dead end. The 115 souls were never seen again by English eyes. For the Elizabethan world, this was not merely a logistical failure or a historical puzzle. It was a spiritual event. Many in England, especially those promoting further colonization, interpreted the disappearance through a stern theological lens. The colony had failed to establish a properly pious, orderly community. There were reports of conflict, of a refusal to plant crops in favor of searching for gold, of general discord. In the Puritan mindset taking hold, such a venture required unwavering faith and communal purity to earn God's protection in a savage land. The complete, silent vanishing of the colony, therefore, looked like a divine punishment. God had withdrawn his favor, allowing the wilderness to swallow them as a consequence of their spiritual failing. It became a powerful cautionary tale for the next wave of colonists at Jamestown 20 years later. Leaders like Captain John Smith invoked the ghost of Roanoke, warning that without unity, discipline, and true devotion, they too would be judged and erased. The mystery forced a terrifying question upon every new settler. Were they building a new Jerusalem worthy of blessing, or were they repeating the sins that doomed Roanoke, inviting the same silent, comprehensive verdict from a watchful God? The silent disappearance of Roanoke left a void filled by fearful speculation, but in the 20th century, a far louder and more public catastrophe would serve a similar purpose. The sinking of the RMS Titanic remains the most iconic maritime disaster in history, a collision of ice and steel that took more than 1,500 lives in the freezing North Atlantic on the night of April 14, 1912. Yet, from the moment the first distress signals crackled across the wireless, the tragedy was framed as more than a terrible accident. It was held up as a profound moral lesson. The narrative began with the ship itself, a floating palace hailed as the largest and most luxurious man-made moving object on Earth. The White Star Line, while never officially using the word in advertising, allowed the idea to flourish in press reports that the Titanic was practically unsinkable due to its revolutionary design with 16 watertight compartments. This belief in technological invincibility permeated the voyage, from the confident pace maintained in known ice fields to the tragically insufficient number of lifeboats deemed almost unnecessary for such a vessel. In the public mind, the ship became the ultimate symbol of human hubris, a towering edifice of pride steaming blindly into the dark. When the unthinkable happened, and that pride was punctured by a shelf of ice, the interpretations came swiftly and sternly. In pulpits across America and Britain the following Sunday, preachers did not merely mourn, they thundered. The Titanic was a modern Tower of Babel, they declared, and its sinking was a divine rebuke against the arrogance of an age that believed it could conquer nature with machinery and luxury. Newspaper editorials wove the disaster into narratives of cosmic justice, suggesting that the wealthy elite aboard, indulging in extravagance while so many lived in poverty, had been particularly marked for this humbling. The stark class divide evident in the survival statistics, where a first-class man had a better chance of living than a third-class child, was seen not as a failure of procedure, but as a reflection of a corrupted social order being judged. Sensational stories bloomed in the fertile soil of grief, including the persistent but entirely false rumor that the ship was carrying the cursed mummy of an Egyptian priestess whose malevolent spirit had doomed the voyage. This detail, though fabricated, perfectly captured the zeitgeist, connecting the old, superstitious idea of a pharaoh's curse to the new, gleaming symbol of modern folly. The profound cultural impact of the Titanic lies in this seamless fusion of accident and allegory. It was a devastating engineering and human failure, yes, but for a world on the cusp of the Great War, it served as a stark cautionary parable. The lesson was clear: no creation of human hands, no matter how grand or brilliantly conceived, is beyond the reach of a higher power's judgment when it is propelled by overconfidence. The icy waters did not just swallow a ship, they swallowed the Edwardian era's unshakable faith in progress and privilege, delivering a verdict that echoed far beyond the Atlantic's lonely depths. It was a modern divine punishment witnessed by the world via telegraph, reminding humanity that the most dangerous iceberg is the one made of pride. The icy judgment that met the Titanic's pride was born of the sea, but the mountains could deliver a slower, more intimate verdict. In the spring of 1846, a group of families known as the Donner Party set out from Illinois for the promise of California, joining the Great Migration westward. They were not reckless pioneers, but hopeful settlers led by two brothers, George and Jacob Donner, seeking a better life. Their fate, however, would be sealed by a single, fateful decision. At a crossroads in present-day Wyoming, they chose to follow the advice of a promoter's guidebook and take a supposed shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff, bypassing the established trail. It was a gamble based on untested information, a choice to leave the known path for a rumored faster route. The cutoff proved to be a brutal disaster. It led them through the waterless salt flats of Utah and over the rugged Wasatch Mountains, costing them precious weeks of travel time and exhausting their oxen. By the time they struggled back to the main trail near the Nevada border, they were critically behind schedule. A deep sense of foreboding settled over the group as they pushed toward the final, towering barrier, the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were racing against the turning of the seasons. In late October, early snows began to fall. By early November, just as they reached a high mountain pass now named for them, a monstrous blizzard trapped them completely. The snow was so deep it buried the trees, creating an impassable white prison. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe of starvation and desperation. They slaughtered their remaining oxen, then boiled hides and bones for glue-like sustenance. Attempts to send small parties over the pass on foot to get help ended in frostbite, death, and retreat. As the weeks turned to months in their makeshift cabins and snow caves, the unthinkable became the only option for some. To survive, they resorted to cannibalism, consuming the flesh of those who had perished. Of the 87 original members, only 48 survived to reach California the following spring, many of them children who endured horrors beyond telling. When news of the tragedy reached the settled East, the public reaction was one of profound shock and moral reckoning. Newspaper reports sensationalized the cannibalism, but preachers and commentators focused on the root cause. This was not seen as simple bad luck. It was interpreted as a severe divine punishment. The group's decision to take the Hastings Cutoff was framed as an act of folly, greed for speed, and a defiant rejection of conventional wisdom and community knowledge. They had chosen a new, prideful path over the old, proven one. In the religious mindset of the time, this was tantamount to ignoring God's providence and tempting fate. The established trail was seen as the path of safety and godly order, the shortcut as a path of reckless ambition. Their suffering in the snowy wilderness, therefore, became a grim morality play preached from pulpits across the nation. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of poor judgment, of straying from the established path both literally and morally. The Donner Party's tragedy was transformed into a powerful parable, a warning that when humans let impatience and pride guide them away from the collective wisdom of the community, they risk invoking a terrible, isolating judgment, left to face the brutal arithmetic of survival alone in the silent, white court of the mountains. A single falling tower could challenge an entire worldview. Within the teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, there is a brief, almost offhand mention of a local tragedy. Some people told him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices, a shocking act of political violence. Jesus responded with a pointed question. Do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? Then he immediately provided his own example. Or those 18 who died when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think they were more guilty than all the others living in Jerusalem? His answer was a definitive, I tell you, no. This small, collapsed tower in Jerusalem, a mundane accident of faulty construction or perhaps an earthquake, becomes a pivotal moment in the long history of how humanity interprets disaster. For centuries, the dominant assumption, as we have seen in so many of these tales, was direct correlation. Calamity was a divine verdict, a targeted strike against specific wickedness. The fall of a tower that killed 18 people would have been, to many ancient minds, clear evidence that those 18 were being punished for some hidden, grievous sin. They were the greater sinners. Jesus directly refutes this. He dismantles the comforting but cruel logic that allows observers to distance themselves from tragedy, to believe the afflicted somehow deserved their fate, thereby assuring themselves of their own safety and righteousness. But he does not stop there. He does not say these events are meaningless. Instead, he offers a profound shift in perspective. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. The point of the falling tower is not to identify who is guilty, but to remind everyone of their own universal need for reflection and moral reckoning. The tragedy is not a targeted punishment, but a general warning, a call for all to examine their lives. This represents a seismic evolution in the concept of divine punishment. It moves the focus from a transactional model where specific sin earns specific disaster to a more nuanced philosophical understanding. It acknowledges the terrifying randomness of the world where towers fall on the just and the unjust alike, while still insisting that such events carry a spiritual message for the collective. The world is not a simple moral scoreboard, but neither is it morally neutral. The human tendency to see disaster as retribution, however, is not so easily erased. Even within this teaching, we see its stubborn power. The very fact that Jesus had to address the question means people were asking it, instinctively reaching for the old, simple story of sin and consequence. 2,000 years later, we still do it. When a hurricane devastates a city, some will inevitably call it judgment. When illness strikes, the first question for many is, what did I do to deserve this? The Tower of Siloam stands as a quiet, enduring counter-argument to that impulse. It asks us to sit with a harder truth that suffering is often indiscriminate, and that the true lesson of a falling stone is not about the guilt of those beneath it, but about the fragility of us all. The lesson of the falling tower warned against misreading random tragedy, but what about punishments that follow clear and specific commands? Our journey returns to the wilderness, to the very people who witnessed the 10 plagues and walked through a parted sea. The Israelites were free, but freedom in the desert brought a terrifying new reality, scarcity. With the adrenaline of escape fading, their stomachs began to growl. The vast, empty landscape offered no fields, no markets, no certainty. Their gratitude for liberation quickly curdled into complaint. They actually began to long for the fleshpots of Egypt, for the security of their old bondage, because at least there they had food. It was a profound crisis of faith. Would the God who defeated Pharaoh now let them starve? In response, the divine provision was both miraculous and methodical. God promised bread from heaven. Each morning, a layer of fine, flake-like substance appeared on the ground with the dew. They called it manna, meaning, what is it? It could be ground, boiled, or baked, tasting like honey wafers. Alongside this came a clear, daily test of trust. They were to gather only what they needed for that day, about an omer per person. No more. On the 6th day, they were to gather a double portion, because the 7th day was a Sabbath of rest, when no manna would appear. This was the covenant of the wilderness, daily dependence. The punishment for disobedience was not fire or flood, but putrefaction. Some, driven by anxiety or greed, tried to hoard extra manna anyway. They stored it away, seeking a security outside of the daily provision. By morning, the hoarded manna was full of maggots and smelled rotten. It became inedible, a graphic lesson in the futility of faithless accumulation. The system worked until the people's discontent turned from hunger to monotony. They grew sick of the miraculous bread. "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing," they cried, "the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." This was the ultimate insult, not just complaining about need, but spurning the gift itself. In response, God sent not punishment, but an overwhelming fulfillment of their craving. A wind drove an immense flock of quail from the sea, covering the camp to a day's journey in every direction, piled 2 cubits deep. The people spent 2 days gathering the birds, a frenzy of acquisition. But as they began to eat, while the meat was still between their teeth, a severe plague struck the camp. Many of those who had craved the meat died there, and the place was named Kibroth Hattava, the graves of craving. This is a uniquely layered tale of divine punishment. It targets not idolatry or murder, but the subtler sins of a freed people: ingratitude, faithless anxiety, and a corrosive nostalgia for slavery. The punishments fit the crimes perfectly. Hoarding the manna, it rots, teaching that trust cannot be stockpiled. Despising the daily miracle, you get your desire in such excess it becomes a tomb. The message is stark: liberation is not the end of the test, but the beginning. The divine provider demands not just obedience, but a specific kind of trust, a day-by-day acceptance that the path to promise runs through a desert where the only guaranteed sustenance is the one you cannot control. It asks a haunting question of any of us who have ever been rescued from one hardship only to complain about the next. What does it mean to be saved and then to fail the test of daily bread? The plaster casts are not statues, but voids made solid. They are the haunting negatives of the final moments of Pompeii's people, created when archaeologists poured liquid plaster into the hollows left by bodies encased in volcanic ash. One figure, often called the muleteer, lies face down, his tunic pulled over his head in a desperate, futile attempt to shield himself from the searing gas and ash. His posture is not one of dramatic agony, but of simple human self-protection, a gesture we all understand. In another poignant find, 2 casts were discovered together, one lying with its head on the other's chest. They are commonly interpreted as a couple embracing in their final seconds, a silent testament to love and companionship facing the end. Then there is the cast of the dog, found contorted on its back, still wearing its bronze-studded collar. This animal, likely chained to guard its home, met a terrifying and inescapable fate, its final struggle frozen for eternity. These are not anonymous victims of history, they are individuals, and their silent screams of plaster force us to confront the human scale of the catastrophe. Beyond the casts, the city's abrupt pause is etched into the most mundane objects. In a bakery, carbonized loaves of bread remain in the oven, never to be retrieved. Jars of garum, the pungent fish sauce Romans loved, sit sealed in pantry shelves. A child's cradle, a set of surgical tools, a board game with pieces in mid-play, all speak of lives interrupted not at a moment of high drama, but in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Even the walls whisper with immediacy. Electoral graffiti urges support for a local candidate. A tavern wall bears a scrawled debt: "I owe you 875 denarii." Another simply states, "I made bread here." These are not the grand inscriptions of emperors, but the ephemeral chatter of daily existence, silenced in an instant. This incredible, intimate preservation is what makes Pompeii the ultimate case study. Archaeology provides no evidence that these specific individuals were being punished for their sins. The baker, the embracing couple, the chained dog, were not moral actors in a cosmic drama. they were simply there. Yet it is precisely this overwhelming, random humanity that amplifies the ancient interpretation of the event as divine judgment. When we stand before that cast of the man shielding his face, we are not thinking of geological fault lines. We feel a visceral, empathetic connection to his terror. That connection, for the Roman mind, demanded an explanation proportionate to the horror. Random chance felt too cruel, too meaningless. It was more comprehensible, perhaps even more comforting, to believe such an awesome, indiscriminate force was directed by a conscious will, that the gods had a reason, however inscrutable, for turning the mountain against the city. Pompeii's tragedy lies in this duality. The volcano did not target the wicked, it simply erupted. But by freezing the innocent in their final, ordinary acts, it created the most powerful possible canvas upon which humanity could project its oldest story. That catastrophe must be a verdict, turning a bustling city and its unaware citizens into eternal symbols of a fate interpreted as divine. This cascade of natural disasters begins not with a command, but with a microscopic organism. The first plague, the Nile turning to blood, finds a compelling modern parallel in a phenomenon known as a toxic algal bloom, often called a red tide. Under specific conditions like unusual heat or an influx of nutrients from upstream, a population of algae called dinoflagellates can explode in the river. These tiny organisms produce pigments that stain the water a deep, rusty red, giving it the appearance of blood. More critically, these blooms deplete oxygen in the water, creating a dead zone that suffocates fish, whose rotting bodies would further foul the river. This is not a supernatural transformation, but a devastating ecological collapse. The death of the fish, considered a staple food and a symbol of the Nile's life-giving power, would have been a catastrophic blow to both the economy and the Egyptian psyche. From this initial calamity, the dominoes of disaster begin to fall. The second plague, the frogs, follows with grim logic. Frogs, whose skin is permeable, are highly sensitive to toxic water. A massive algal bloom would force them to flee the poisoned river en masse, seeking refuge on land. They would invade homes and streets not as a random infestation, but as refugees from an ecological nightmare, only to die in heaps as the toxins took their toll. Their decaying bodies then set the stage for the next horrors. The piles of dead frogs and fish would become a perfect breeding ground for insects. The third and fourth plagues of lice or gnats and then flies could easily be explained as a population explosion of pests like mosquitoes, fleas, and stable flies thriving in the unsanitary conditions. These insects are not just nuisances, they are vectors for disease. This brings us to the fifth plague, the deadly murrain that struck Egyptian livestock. The flies swarming from the rotting biomass could have carried a virulent pathogen like anthrax or a similar hemorrhagic disease, spreading it rapidly among cattle and other animals gathered near contaminated water sources. The sixth plague, of painful boils breaking out on people and beasts, aligns with skin infections that can be transmitted by insect bites or from direct contact with contaminated water and soil. The narrative of a targeted, escalating judgment is already taking shape from purely ecological causes. But to explain the final, dramatic plagues, we must look to a far more violent event on the horizon. A colossal volcanic eruption, like the cataclysm at Thera on the island of Santorini around 1600 BC, could provide the missing piece. Such an eruption would have spewed millions of tons of ash and pumice into the upper atmosphere. This ash cloud, carried by prevailing winds, could have drifted over Egypt. The seventh plague, a storm of hail and fire mingled, could describe a severe electrical storm, with volcanic pumice or burning ejecta falling from the sky, a terrifying phenomenon for a land that rarely saw hail. The eighth plague, the locusts, finds explanation in the strange weather patterns triggered by the eruption. Ash clouds can disrupt normal wind and rainfall, creating ideal conditions for locust swarms to form and descend upon the remaining crops. Then comes the ninth plague, a darkness so thick it could be felt. This is a classic description of a volcanic ash fall dense enough to blot out the sun for days, turning day into an eerie, impenetrable twilight. The air would be choked with fine particles, making it difficult to breathe. Finally, we arrive at the most personal and tragic plague, the death of the firstborn sons. In a culture where the eldest male ate first and received the choicest portion, a final, cruel twist of biology offers a theory. The preceding climatic chaos with ash-laden dampness could have led to stored grain becoming moldy. Certain molds produce potent mycotoxins. If the firstborn sons, as was their privilege, were given the first and largest share of the contaminated grain from the family stores, they would have received a concentrated, lethal dose, while younger siblings might have eaten less or none at all. In a single night, a natural poison could have delivered a blow that seemed meticulously targeted by a vengeful god. When viewed as a sequence, the theory is breathtaking. A toxic algal bloom triggers an ecological chain reaction, which is then amplified and capped by the regional effects of a distant volcanic super-eruption. Each event is scientifically plausible, and each follows logically from the one before. For the ancient Egyptians and Israelites living through this year of horrors, however, there was no satellite imagery or microbiology. There was only the overwhelming experience of their world unraveling, system by system, in a precise order that felt intentional. The natural cascade theory does not diminish the power of the Exodus story, it deepens it. It reveals how the human mind, confronted with a series of catastrophic but linked events, instinctively weaves them into a narrative. It is our profound need to see pattern and purpose, especially in suffering, that transforms a tragic convergence of earth, water, and climate into the ultimate story of divine judgment and deliverance. Yet the man who should have been the curse's first and primary target defied its logic completely. Howard Carter, the archaeologist who personally breached the sealed doorway and spent years intimately handling the tomb's contents, lived for another 17 years after the opening. He died of lymphoma at the age of 64, a death from natural causes after a long and productive career. This single fact alone unravels the supernatural narrative. When we examine the other so-called victims with a statistical lens, the pattern of a curse dissolves further. Lord Carnarvon was 56 years old and in chronically poor health, a man who had survived a serious car accident years before and suffered from chronic lung issues. In an era before antibiotics, a simple infected insect bite was a genuine mortal danger. Arthur Mace, another team member who died, was already in declining health and had left the excavation early due to illness. The radiologist who X-rayed the mummy died from a pre-existing disease. If we track the life expectancy and causes of death for the 24 people most directly involved with the tomb, we find no statistically significant deviation from what would be expected for a group of Europeans in the 1920s. The curse was not a supernatural force, but a perfect storm of coincidence, psychology, and sensational journalism. The real architects of the curse were not ancient priests, but modern storytellers. The London Daily Mail, a newspaper known for its dramatic flair, seized upon Carnarvon's death and wove a narrative of mystical vengeance. They were heavily influenced by a popular novelist of the day, Marie Corelli, who had written a letter published just before Carnarvon's death warning that dire punishment would follow any disturbance of a pharaoh's rest. After his passing, she claimed to have predicted it all, lending her literary authority to the myth. The press ran with it, connecting every subsequent death, no matter how distant or unrelated, back to the tomb. A man who had merely visited the site died in a traffic accident, the curse. A relative of a museum curator passed away from illness, the curse. The media created a self-fulfilling prophecy where any misfortune touching anyone even tangentially linked to Tutankhamun was filtered through the lens of the curse, while the many who lived long lives were ignored. This media frenzy ignited a global phenomenon known as Tutmania. The discovery coincided with the dawn of mass media, and the world was captivated. Art Deco designs borrowed Egyptian motifs, fashion featured scarab brooches and lotus patterns, and popular songs celebrated the boy king. The curse narrative was the dark, thrilling shadow to this glittering fascination. It provided a moral counterweight to the excitement, a Gothic warning that tempered the modern pride of the excavation. This duality cemented the story in popular culture, where it was endlessly amplified by Hollywood. Films from the 1930s onward portrayed vengeful mummies stalking archaeologists, embedding the idea of divine punishment for tomb robbers deep in the collective unconscious. The curse became a staple of adventure novels and comic books, a shorthand for the dangers of trespassing into the sacred past. So why does this specific story of divine punishment, so thoroughly debunked, endure with such power? It succeeds because it answers to a deeper human truth than mere fact. The curse of the pharaohs taps into a primal fear of violating sacred spaces, of awakening a sleeping past we do not understand. It romanticizes the idea that ancient oaths hold power, that a promise carved in stone 3,000 years ago can still demand payment today. In a secular, scientific age, it offers a thrilling whisper that the world might still hold old magic, that consequence can stretch across millennia to touch the disrespectful. It transforms archaeologists from scholars into modern-day protagonists in a moral drama, facing not just dust and artifacts, but the judgment of history itself. Ultimately, the curse endures not because it is true, but because we want it to be. It confirms a satisfying, dramatic order to the universe where every transgression, even the intellectual transgression of curiosity, meets a fitting and poetic reply. The scientific lens that reframed the plagues now turns its gaze toward the scorched plains of the Jordan Valley. For generations, the search for the sinful cities was mired in tradition, often focusing on sites at the Dead Sea's southern end. But in the early 21st century, an archaeologist named Stephen Collins proposed a radical shift. He argued that if one followed the geographical clues in the biblical text without preconception, they pointed not to the south but to a vast, fertile plain north of the Dead Sea. His candidate was a sprawling mound known as Tall el-Hammam. Excavations there have revealed a city that was indeed a major power in the Middle Bronze Age, a formidable kingdom that met a sudden and inexplicable end around 1650 B. See, the destruction layer uncovered is unlike anything seen from conventional warfare or earthquake. It speaks of an instant apocalyptic fire. Pottery sherds found on the site's surface have an outer layer melted into glass. Mud brick walls appear to have been sheared off at their foundations, with fragments of brick melted and bubbled. Zircon crystals in the pottery were transformed into gas at temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a heat far beyond the capability of any ancient kiln or common fire. This is evidence of a short, intense thermal pulse that could flash melt materials in seconds. For many scientists, the most plausible explanation is a cosmic airburst, similar to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, where a meteor or comet exploded in the atmosphere, releasing energy equivalent to a large nuclear bomb. The shockwave would have flattened structures for miles, followed by a searing thermal wind that instantly ignited everything and everyone below. If a memory of this cataclysm survived for centuries among nomadic tribes, how would it be described by those who came later? A rain of fire and brimstone from the heavens fits perfectly. The archaeological record at Tall el-Hammam also shows that after this event, the entire region was abandoned for centuries, the soil seemingly poisoned, unable to support agriculture. This matches the biblical description of a once fertile plain rendered permanently barren. The story then becomes a profound fusion of history and morality. A real, terrifying, and inexplicable event devastated a powerful city. The survivors and their descendants grappled with the why. Why us? Why then? The answer they settled upon was not geological but theological. Such an unimaginable punishment, they reasoned, must have been for an unimaginable sin. The narrative of Sodom and Gomorrah provided that moral framework, transforming a random cosmic impact into a definitive lesson on hospitality, corruption, and the limits of divine patience. It takes a real scar on the earth and fills it with meaning, ensuring that the crater, whether physical or metaphorical, would never be forgotten. Plato's Atlantis was never meant to be found on a map. For the philosopher, this was not an archaeological puzzle but a philosophical one, a story crafted with deliberate purpose to illustrate a terrifying truth about human societies. In his dialogue Critias, Plato paints two contrasting portraits. First, there is ancient Athens, his idealized version of the city-state. This Athens is governed by reason and virtue, its citizens living in harmonious order, prioritizing wisdom over wealth and communal good over individual greed. They are the embodiment of his philosophical ideals, a society ruled by guardian philosophers long before his own time. Standing against them is the Empire of Atlantis, a mirror image of corruption. Founded by the offspring of the sea god Poseidon, Atlantis begins with a divine heritage and a constitution of noble laws. But over generations, the divine portion within them fades, diluted by too much mortal ambition. They cease to value wisdom or justice, becoming obsessed instead with material splendor, military conquest, and the raw exercise of power. Their moral decay is not a private failing but a public policy, an imperial hunger that drives them to enslave their neighbors and eventually launch an unprovoked war against the virtuous Athenians. This is the crucial conflict, the divine punishment that follows. The island swallowed by the sea in a day and night is not a random act of godly wrath. It is the inevitable, almost mechanical consequence Plato is trying to demonstrate. A society that abandons the foundational virtues of wisdom, moderation, and justice for the pursuits of luxury and domination contains the seeds of its own destruction. The cataclysm is simply nature, or the gods who uphold natural order, enforcing a cosmic law. The sea does not punish Atlantis because it is powerful, it swallows Atlantis because it became unjust. This transforms the tale from a lost history into one of the most potent political warnings ever conceived. Plato was writing in a 4th century Athens that had itself suffered the ravages of war and the corruptions of empire. Through Atlantis, he was holding up a dark mirror, arguing that any state, no matter how advanced or blessed, will collapse from within if its soul rots. The story's genius is its adaptability. For centuries, thinkers have seen the ghost of Atlantis in the fall of Rome, where internal decadence and overextension weakened the empire long before barbarians breached the gates. They see it in the hubris of modern empires that believed their technological or economic might make them invincible, only to crumble under the weight of their own unsustainable ambitions. Every time a civilization confuses material grandeur with moral strength, the parable of Atlantis whispers from the deep. Its enduring power lies not in its sunken columns, but in its chilling question, a question that echoes far beyond any ocean. If your society were weighed on the scales of justice and wisdom today, would it be found worthy, or would it too be waiting for the sea to give its verdict? The rigid, fear-soaked atmosphere of 16th century Strasbourg was a pressure cooker with no release valve. This was not a society gently guided by faith, but one gripped by a terror of divine displeasure. The Church preached a relentless message of sin and imminent judgment, where every misfortune was a personal rebuke from God. After years of failed harvests, the poor were not just starving, they were drowning in a theological conviction that their hunger was their own fault, a sign of their collective wickedness. Disease was not a biological event but a scourge. In this world, anxiety was not a private feeling, it was the very air they breathed, a constant, humiliating proof of their unworthiness before a wrathful deity. When Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began her frantic dance, she did not start a disease. She gave the community's silent scream a body. This phenomenon, where extreme psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms across a group, is understood today as mass psychogenic illness. Think of it not as a virus but as a contagion of the mind. In an environment where people believe a specific terrifying symptom is possible, and where they see it happening to others, their own bottled-up stress can unconsciously mimic it. The body seizes upon a culturally available script for expressing unbearable pressure. In medieval Strasbourg, that script was written in fear of Saint Vitus. The idea of a punishing dance was already in the cultural lexicon, a known form of divine chastisement. So when one person, likely suffering from a breakdown triggered by starvation and existential dread, began to dance, it created a terrifying permission for others. Their own latent terror, their own conviction that they deserved punishment, found its perfect, horrifying outlet. They were not faking. Their feet bled, their muscles tore, their hearts gave out. The pain was devastatingly real, generated by a mind pushed beyond its limits. Therefore, the dancing plague achieves a dark, paradoxical unity. The community believed they were being punished by God for their sins. And in a profound sense, they were absolutely right. The punishment was not an external force striking them down. It was the internalized terror of that very belief now erupting through their own limbs. Their collective psyche, poisoned by famine and dogma, became the instrument of its own torment. They danced because on some unconscious level they believed they should. The plague was the verdict, the sentence, and the executioner, all performed by the condemned themselves. It stands as one of history's most tragic examples of a prophecy fulfilling itself, where the fear of divine wrath became so total, so consuming, that the only logical response was to embody it, to dance until the body could no longer bear the weight of its own terrified soul. The medals were struck almost before the last Spanish ship had foundered. In gleaming gold and silver, they bore the profile of Queen Elizabeth I, a symbol of the triumphant state, and on the reverse, a simple, devastating scene. Spanish galleons are tossed on stormy waves beneath a radiant light from heaven, and around the edge runs the Latin inscription, Flavit Jehovah et dissipati sunt. Jehovah blew with his winds, and they were scattered. This was not just a commemorative token, it was a theological statement minted into currency, a physical object declaring that the storm was not weather but the breath of God. The narrative took root with astonishing speed, woven into the very fabric of English identity. From pulpits across the nation, preachers thundered sermons declaring the victory a modern-day miracle, a direct parallel to the destruction of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. England, they proclaimed, was a new Israel, a Protestant nation uniquely favored and protected by divine providence. The Queen herself was cast in this sacred light, her rule legitimized not just by bloodline but by apparent heavenly mandate. This interpretation flowed into popular ballads, pamphlets, and later into grand history paintings, which depicted angels themselves guiding English cannonballs or pushing Spanish ships onto the rocks. The Armada's defeat became England's foundational myth of divine election, a story told to schoolchildren for generations, reinforcing a sense of national destiny and moral superiority that would underpin the growing British Empire. It was the ultimate propaganda victory, transforming a complex naval campaign hindered by weather into a clean, cosmic verdict. Across the Channel, the story was necessarily different. In Spain, the catastrophe was a source of profound grief and soul-searching. Official accounts and chroniclers, while devoutly Catholic, often framed the disaster in more practical or neutrally providential terms. They spoke of el fracaso de la empresa, the failure of the enterprise, citing the Duke of Medina Sidonia's inexperience, the superior English tactics, and the crippling logistical failures. When they invoked God, it was often with a tone of somber mystery or chastisement. Some theologians and writers within Spain quietly wondered if the loss was a divine punishment, not on Protestant England, but on Spain itself for the pride and excessive cruelty of its own imperial ambitions. Had the king's hubris in undertaking such a vast, holy war invited this humbling? This internal doubt was a private, painful counter-narrative to England's public triumph. The same set of events, ships, storms, and shattered timbers, thus produced two competing miracles. For England, a punishing wind proved they were right. For Spain, a punishing wind prompted questions about where they had gone wrong. This is the enduring power of the Armada story in our series. It lays bare the mechanism of myth-making. Catastrophes and victories are rarely left as simple facts. We instinctively mold them into evidence, proof for the story we need to tell about ourselves and our place in the world. The Protestant wind was not merely a meteorological event. It was the gust that filled the sails of a national legend for centuries, a perpetual reminder that in the theater of history, divine punishment and divine favor are often just two sides of the same, very human coin. Nero's attempt to blame the Christians did not extinguish the smoldering resentment in Rome. The fire and its brutal aftermath were a spark that ignited a slow-burning fuse beneath his own throne. His popularity, already fragile, collapsed entirely. The Roman elite saw a tyrant who would burn his own city for a palace, and the people saw a monster who lit his gardens with human torches. This profound alienation created a vacuum of loyalty that soon filled with rebellion. First came the distant but costly Jewish revolt in Judea in 66 A.D., a massive drain on imperial resources and prestige. Then, in 68, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Gaius Julius Vindex, raised the standard of revolt in Gaul. His was not a call for independence but a moral indictment. Vindex denounced Nero as a wretched lyre player and a matricide, framing his rebellion as a righteous act to free the Senate and people of Rome from a debauched artist tyrant. Though Vindex was defeated by loyalist forces, the dam had broken. The Senate, sensing the shift in the wind and emboldened by the revolt, finally moved. With the Praetorian Guard withdrawing their support, Nero was declared a public enemy by the very body that had long cowered before him. He fled Rome in disguise, taking refuge in a freedman's villa outside the city. As horsemen closed in to arrest him and drag him to a grisly public execution, he realized the end had come. Lacking the courage to take his own life, he required his private secretary to help him drive a dagger into his throat. His reported last words were a perfect tragicomic echo of his reign's grotesque vanity. "What an artist dies in me." For the Roman people and the historians who recorded his fall, this was not a random political collapse. It was the completion of a moral arc, the ultimate divine punishment finally delivered. Nero's crimes were legion: parricide for allegedly murdering his mother Agrippina, tyranny for his brutal rule, and sacrilege for his perceived mockery of tradition and his persecution of the Christians. The fire had been the opening act of heaven's judgment, and his ignoble suicide was the closing curtain. The Senate ratified this cosmic verdict with a legal one, damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. His statues were torn down, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his reign erased from official history as if the gods themselves had demanded it be wiped clean. But erasure is never complete. Nero's legacy found fertile ground in the very community he had tried to exterminate. In early Christian writings, he became the archetype of evil, the first great persecutor, even the Antichrist in some interpretations. His monstrous acts served as a dark backdrop against which the faith of the martyrs shone all the brighter. The fire of Rome, which he used as an instrument of terror against them, instead became in their theology a divine spark of a different kind, the beginning of the end for their persecutor. His deserved ruin was proof that even an emperor who styled himself a god was not beyond the reach of a higher justice. The chain that began with a flickering flame in a wooden shop ended, fittingly, with a self-absorbed whisper in a dusty villa, a final performance for an audience of one judged by the ages. And so our journey through 25 tales of divine judgment comes to a close. From the silent curse of a pharaoh's tomb to the roaring fire that swallowed Pompeii, From the frantic dance in a Strasbourg street to the icy grave of a ship called Titanic, we have traced a persistent pattern in the human story. Across continents and centuries, whenever catastrophe struck, our ancestors instinctively searched for a verdict. They looked at a fallen tower, a sunken fleet, or a vanished colony and asked not just how but why. The answer they so often found was one of cosmic justice, a divine punishment that transformed random suffering into a meaningful, if terrifying, lesson. These narratives are far more than ancient superstition. They are the foundational stories civilizations told themselves to explain a frightening world. A plague was not just bacteria, it was a rebuke. A storm was not just weather, it was a breath of divine will. By seeing disaster as a consequence, people could impose order on chaos. It provided comfort in a strange way, suggesting the universe was not indifferent but actively moral, punishing the wicked and, by implication, protecting the righteous. These tales became tools for social control, warning kings against hubris and communities against sin. They shaped laws, inspired art, and forged identities like the Protestant wind that defined England for generations. So what are we to make of them today in our age of satellites and science? The truth likely lies in the fertile ground between the extremes. The fire that rained on Sodom may have been a cosmic airburst. The plagues of Egypt could have been a chain reaction of ecological collapse. The dancing plague was almost certainly mass psychogenic illness, a physical scream from a terrified psyche. Yet, reducing these stories to mere natural events misses their profound power. The real magic is not in the supposed miracle, but in the meaning-making. When our ancestors witnessed an event so awesome it defied understanding, they did not just record it, they interpreted it. They wrapped the raw fact of a volcano in a narrative of divine anger because that framework made the unbearable comprehensible. These 25 tales ultimately hold up a mirror to us. They reflect our enduring need to believe that actions have consequences that ripple through the very fabric of reality, that there is a balance to the cosmos. Whether you see these stories as compelling coincidences, psychological projections, or echoes of a deeper spiritual truth, their legacy is undeniable. They remind us that history is never just a list of dates and battles. It is also a tapestry woven from fear, faith, and the relentless human quest to find a moral in the storm. What do you think? Are these ancient verdicts simply the stories we told to explain the unexplainable? Or do they point to something more? Share your favorite tale or your own theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the crossroads of history and mystery, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of our past. Thanks for watching.